Hi everyone, welcome to Internal Control Talks. Our goal with this podcast is to help you thrive as an internal control professional by bringing you the best advice from industry leaders. Today we will talk with our guest, Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, about how cognitive biases can lead us to poor decision making and what we can do to make better choices in our professional and personal life. We will also talk about how business leaders might misjudge risks and what risks and control professionals can do to help them evaluating risks better. We will talk specifically about the tendency of underestimating the risks created by the coronavirus. Dr. Gleb Tsipursky is a best-selling author, international speaker, consultant, and CEO of the boutique consulting, coaching, and training firm Disaster Avoidance Experts, which help leaders and organizations to avoid business disasters by addressing potential threats, maximizing unexpected opportunities, and resolving persistent personal problems. Gleb, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here to talk about risks, decision-making, and cognitive biases.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate you inviting me.
Absolutely. In addition to your deep experience from your consulting work, you also have strong research and teaching background in behavioral economics and neuroscience, with over 15 years in academia, including 7 years as a professor at The Ohio State University, and before that as a fellow at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. You also authored several books, including your latest one, which I really enjoyed, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. In the book, you talk about situations where gut decisions can be helpful and others where they will likely lead us to make wrong decisions. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Of course. Now, the problem with our gut decision-making, well, there are several problems. One problem is that everyone advises you to go with your gut, follow your intuitions, trust your heart, especially when you don't have sufficient data. And that's very bad advice because our gut reactions, our intuitions, our instincts are not adapted for the modern business environment, whether the internet control environment or other modern situations. The gut instincts and intuitions are adapted to the savanna environment when we were hunters and foragers living in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people. And so therefore we have very poor responses for most of the kind of challenges, issues that face us in the modern environment, in our professional lives at least. For example, one of the most primary aspects of that environment that we found ourselves in was tribalism, which means it was very important for us to look for people who looked like us, who thought like us, who shared our values, to be part of a tribe. If we weren't sufficiently tribal, we would be kicked out of the tribe and then we would die. We are the descendants of those people who didn't die, so we are very tribal as a result. That's one example. Another example is our response to threats like the coronavirus pandemic or to internet threats, all sorts of issues, phishing and so on. These are the kinds of things that we are intuitively predisposed to respond to with the fight or flight response. Now, the fight or flight response, you might have heard of it, it's all based in the savanna environment when we faced intense, immediate, in-the-moment threats. We had to jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. Unfortunately, or fortunately, in our modern life, we have many less saber-toothed tigers. But we have to address much more insidious threats, whether phishing by email, which is where the vast majority of internet hacking takes place, problems takes place in companies, or the slow-moving train wreck like the coronavirus pandemic, which is, of course, a very serious issue that's not at all similar to the fight or flight response, the intense in the moment threat. But what I see people doing in response to the coronavirus pandemic is very much driven by this fight or flight response, and they're making very bad decisions. And we can talk about that. But these are the reasons and the specific decision-making errors that we fall into when we go with a fight or flight response or the tribalism or other savanna-based impulses and other aspects of how our brain is wired. we make a certain set of decisions, and these decisions are called cognitive biases. When the decision patterns we make are not aligned with the modern world, when we tend to go with that natural, primitive state, when we should instead make civilized decisions that are actually counterintuitive. They don't go with our intuitions. So the cognitive biases are the specific errors that we tend to make, and it's very important to learn about them in order to work on avoiding them effectively.
That's really interesting. I really like your approach to the gut decision, which is very widespread at the moment. Everyone is saying just follow your gut. So I really like your perspective on this. So which cognitive biases, in your opinion, pose the most dangers in business decision making?
There are a number that depend on the situation. One of the biggest ones for leaders, specifically those in leadership positions, one of the biggest ones I've seen is called the optimism bias. Now, the optimism bias is kind of like it sounds. It's when you tend to be very optimistic about the future. That helps people in a leadership position because it helps them be inspiring. People like others who are optimistic. They like people who cheer on others, who think the future is bright, who inspire confidence. However, those people think that, and being honest, I'm a business leader. I run the disaster avoidance experts, 6 people consulting, coaching, and training firm, and I'm an optimist. So it seems to me that the future is, nice and bright. The world is friendly. The grass is green on the other side of the hill, even though it's too often yellow. It seems like I always focus on the opportunities, and I spend way too little time focusing on the threats and the risks and problems. And I tend to have way too high expectations for myself, people around me, people in my company, my business collaborators, and so on, and for projects I take on. So these are serious decision-making errors and problems that are very common for me and very common for business leaders like me, for people who are in a leadership position, whether those running a small company like I do, or those running a large company or a middle market company, or those in a middle management position or a team lead position. Those would be very common problems. So optimism bias. A related one is called overconfidence. Now, it's not quite the same thing. Overconfidence refers to people being way too confident in their judgments. That might be optimistic judgment, might be too pessimistic, but they're overconfident about their judgments. So we have conducted research on these topics, and we see very clearly that leaders who show more optimism and more confidence on various measurements of optimism and confidence tend to make worse decisions in business. So their companies they run make less money. If they do a merger and acquisition activity, they tend to overpay for companies, and their merger and acquisition activity tends to fail more. So there's a lot of problems with these leaders. However, these leaders also often get promoted because they show optimism and they show confidence. And we we intuitively, our gut reaction, our intuition is to orient toward the alpha monkey in the room. So that alpha monkey, that alpha personality, and optimism and confidence is associated with the alpha monkey personality. So even though the decisions made by this leader tend to be often bad, problematic, not good, we still tend to trust them too much. So those are a couple of ones that I want to mention. I can go into many others. My book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, talks about the 30 most dangerous ones and how to address them, how to avoid them. I'll mention another one just right now, just that it's really important. Confirmation bias causes us to look for information that confirms our beliefs and ignore information that doesn't. Now, that very often happens. Let's say I mentioned phishing emails, right? So phishing emails, which I think about 85% of hacking attacks in companies, successful hacking attacks, takes place through phishing. The confirmation bias causes us to cherry pick information intuitively. We're not trying to do it. It's with our gut reactions cause us to, when we look at an email, we tend to look for information that the email is good quality and so on, and then we click on the link. And we ignore information that the email is bad, problematic, and so on, just because of how our gut is wired. And people who do phishing emails, spear phishing or broad phishing, they specifically write the email in mind of people's instincts and intuitions, knowing how to appeal to this confirmation bias, and therefore they get people to click on these emails. So people who aren't aware of the confirmation bias, where we tend to look for information that confirms our beliefs, ignore information that doesn't, they tend to fall much more often for these sorts of problems. And of course, leaders tend to fall for them all the time as well. There was an interesting study conducted by Leadership IQ of 1,087 board members who fired their chief executive officers of 286 companies now and other organizations. And what the study found was that one of the top 5 reasons for firing their leader is denialism, where a leader denies negative facts about the company. That's a very, very common occurrence. I mean, well, right now we have, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen across the board that both political leaders and business leaders, at least outside of Asia, have overwhelmingly denied the facts about COVID-19. And well, not everyone. Iceland has done pretty well. Germany has done relatively well, but very many countries around in Western Europe, in the United States, North America, have denied the facts about COVID-19. They didn't want to acknowledge the negative reality of the situation. And so as a result, they're both the countries, the citizens are suffering a lot, and the businesses are suffering a lot because they've denied the facts, and they're all about 2 weeks behind the curve of where the COVID-19 situation is. And in some cases, like the Brazil, they're a couple of months behind the curve, but not to go too much into politics. So that is one of the biggest problems that we tend to face, where leaders tend to deny negative information about reality. And the COVID-19 pandemic reveals it. With the Boeing, the 737 MAX reveals it. There's a lot of things I can go into, but those are some of the other problems that we happen to have. So some of them come from optimism, confidence, mistakes about judgment, evaluation of risks, and some of their cognitive biases center around mistakes about evaluating accuracy of information. So those are categories of mistakes that we tend to make. And the cognitive biases are the specific types of mistakes we tend to make.
Right. What you just said, and the way you describe the overconfident leaders and the optimistic leader as well, sometimes it's so difficult as risk professional to really raise the awareness around risk, because you face a CEO who is super confident in his vision, everything's gonna go smoothly. I mean, obviously they are aware that not everything is easy, but they definitely tend to underestimate certain risks. And the other component I find quite often, is like when you buy life insurances, it never happens to you. You don't even want to go into the topic because, everybody else can die, but not me. It's never going to happen to me, never going to happen to my company. So yes, there are phishing attempts, but cyber attacks, a lot, right? Raising threats and all of that. But we are good. We are good. So it's a little bit difficult sometimes to raise awareness around the fact that other companies suffer from certain risks and for example cyber attacks, and it can really happen to every company. I think a lot of risk professionals really face the biases of such leaders that you just described.
You're absolutely right. Right now I'm working with the Risk Management Society, which is an international association of risk management professionals based in New York City. And what we're doing is integrating information about cognitive biases into the educational curriculum of the Risk Management Society, because it's very helpful to teach the CEOs and other leaders in the company about these cognitive biases, provide them with professional development before the specific situation comes up. So say, hey, here's a situation, for example, look at what happened with COVID-19, right? A lot of companies, including probably yours, didn't anticipate the problems with COVID-19 because of our cognitive biases. Just our brains, our gut reactions are not predisposed to making the right decisions, to evaluating these complex information accurately. And of course, it comes from the Savannah environment. When we didn't have to deal with something like the slow-moving train wreck of COVID-19, we faced intense and immediate, in-the-moment threats, and our main decision-making is the fight-or-flight response. And of course, the cyber attacks are in exactly the same mode. We had nothing like cyber attacks in the Savannah environment. That didn't exist. So you can draw that parallel and show that, hey, look at these companies suffering from COVID-19. Our company is suffering as well. Well, this is the kind of decision-making patterns that causes us to underestimate all sorts of risks, cyber attacks, all sorts of problems. So how robust is our contingency plan for various problems? Right now, a lot of companies are switching to virtual teams smartly, wisely. That's definitely something they should be doing. But they're not really taking care of their cybersecurity nearly enough when they're doing that switch. And of course, they're going to be preyed upon by hackers of all sorts who are going to be exploiting these vulnerabilities. And the CEOs and other leaders aren't thinking sufficiently about these. But that parallel showing that, hey, here are the cognitive biases that cause us to make bad decisions. So where else can we be making bad decisions? That conversation is really helpful for addressing the problems that leaders tend to suffer.
Definitely. That's really interesting. And what about actually overcoming dangerous judgment errors? Can you talk about the 8-step strategy that you developed to achieve effective decision making?
Happy to, but before I talk about the 8 steps, I want to highlight that each of the cognitive biases has individual techniques that you can use to overcome it. So I told you about the optimism bias, that I tend to suffer from the optimism bias. Now, there are a couple of ways of overcoming that outside of a specific structured technique. So one of the ways to overcome the optimism bias that I've learned is to calibrate. And this is going to be, if you have overconfident, optimistic leaders, this is something that you can use to help them calibrate themselves. Calibration refers to learning how biased you are, how optimistically biased you are. Of course, the pessimism bias is the opposite bias, where it refers to people who are too aware of the risks, who focus too much on the risks. So you need to calibrate for that too. So optimism bias, but we're talking about me, optimism bias, I had to learn how optimistic I am. So for example, if I think that a client is very likely, 90% likely to do what I want them to do when I write an email from a consulting client, I had to learn that the clients are actually much less likely to do what I want them to do. And I had to learn by how much. Now that you can do that by predicting the likelihood that a client will do what you want them to do. Let's say, I think the client is 80% likely to do what I want them to do. So that means that 4 out of 5 times they would do that. And what I learned is that, hey, that it actually happens only 3 out of 5 times. So 3 out of 5 times. So that means I'm 25% overconfident. And therefore, in the future, I can calibrate my intuitions and say, I feel like this project will take 10 hours. It will likely take actually 12 and a half or 13 hours. Or the clients are quite a bit less likely, 25% likely to do what I want them to do. You can do the same thing for yourself, and you can have leaders in your company to do the same thing. Make predictions about what will happen in the future, and then calibrate how optimistic they are actually to help them bring down their optimism and learn how to fight this tendency. So it's just one technique that I want to mention that's really important. But of course, there is a structured technique. This is a technique that you can use to make any major decision. This is for serious decisions, major decisions. Takes about an hour to go through. And there's a quicker technique that takes a couple of minutes that involves 5 questions, which I can talk about later, for everyday decisions that you don't want to screw up. So this technique, the 8-step decision-making model, is for decisions you want to get as right as possible, as perfectly as possible. You want to both minimize risks and maximize rewards. So, first step, you want to identify the need for a decision to be made. Now, this might seem surprising. Don't you already know the decision? Well, you often will miss the need for a decision to be made. So, for example, since we're using COVID-19 as an example, a lot of companies missed the need to switch their teams to virtual spaces. Now, some companies were actually at the forefront of this. So, for example, in the United States, Twitter and Google were at the forefront of switching their teams to virtual work. So that was very good for them. They identified the need for a decision to be made in a timely manner. The large majority of other companies did not, and they had a number of their employees infected, and their business was much more disrupted because they had to make the switch in a much shorter time frame. They were much less prepared to do it. So this is a serious issue that you need to identify the need for a decision to be made by studying the external context. That's one. Second, you want to gather relevant information from a variety of perspectives. Look especially for people who disagree with you. Now, what I tend to do is it's very tempting for me to work with other optimists. So I like optimists, I collaborate really well with them, but I know that I should not run my ideas simply by other optimists, because they'll just reinforce them. They'll just say, yes, that's a great idea. You know, I'm the kind of person who has 20 ideas before breakfast, and I think they're all brilliant. Now, if all five of my other employees in the company had the same tendency, then we would just say everyone would have 20 ideas before breakfast, and we would all think they're brilliant, and we would reinforce each other's ideas. And then we'd be running in 120 different directions, and that's not helpful. So what I learned I had to do is make sure to hire some pessimists into the company and run my ideas by pessimists. And pessimists will take my 20 brilliant ideas and say, well, you know, these are half-baked potatoes, but here these three are worth finishing baking. And they would look at all the problems in these three ideas, because they're terrible at generating ideas, generally speaking. It's not their strength, because they see the exaggerated flaws of each idea. But they're great at evaluating ideas, fixing their flaws, and implementing the ideas. That's their strength. So that's a great way for optimists and pessimists to collaborate together. So you want to make sure to gather relevant information about this topic from a variety of perspectives, especially people who disagree with you, in order to fight that confirmation bias and whatever other decision-making information biases you might have. Then decide on the goals, painting a clear vision of a desired outcome. So you want to make sure very clearly that you know what you're going for. Let's say you're launching a new product. So launching a new cybersecurity product, you want to know what's the market for this product. It might be fun and it might be interesting to put it together. It might feel like it's useful for you, but if you're the only person who thinks it's useful, that's not going to help anybody. So you want to make sure to study the market for this and have a clear vision of how people will be using it, how it will be different from the existing products, how it will fill a niche that's currently not filled, whether on functionality, on pricing, or a variety of other factors. So that's something that you need to do when you're preparing to launch a product. This applies to when you're preparing to launch a project within a company as well. So when you're launching a cybersecurity project, what's the goal? What's the outcome? How are people going to be using it? Have a very clear and specific vision. Next. 4, develop clear decision-making criteria to evaluate your options. So let's say you're thinking about running a cybersecurity project within the company. You want to think about what are the criteria. Well, the criteria might be how much more security will be added by this project. Criteria might be how easy will it be to use, because, you know, it can add a lot of security, but if nobody uses it, that's not really going to help you. So ease of use. Then how much change will be required in the project? Because the more change will be required, the less likely people will go over that hurdle. So these might be 3 criteria. Of course, the 4th one would be how much support do you have from the top level? Then a 5th one might be how many resources might this project require? So you might have those 5 criteria. And then you evaluate each of these criteria. How important is this criteria for each of the viable options that you're going to generate in the next step? So for example, it might be very, very incredibly important for you to have top level buy-in. So on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is low, 10 is high, you would rate top level buy-in as a 10. Now it might be less important for you to, let's say, have how much change will be required, because having that top level buy-in will overcome the hurdle of change. So the change management aspect of it, you could say it would be a 5. And then let's say for ease of use, you know that your employees are somewhat reluctant to use. Let's say you're working in a company of lawyers, and lawyers are notorious. I've worked with lawyers as a management consultant. doing things inside the company, it's very hard to get lawyers to change their behavior. So not simply change management inside the company, but they're only going to be using something if it's easy to use. And they have a lot of independence, each individual lawyer. So you'll probably put ease of use as maybe around a 7 or 8 in that context. So yes, so go through each criteria and evaluate, give them a certain weight. Then generate viable options that can achieve your goals. So you want to really focus on this step. Don't skip it. Most people who go through making a project just generate one viable plan for a project, and they just say, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is our plan. That's a bad idea. You want to generate at least 5 viable options. It means 5 options for various project plans, so you can evaluate on your criteria, which is the next step, number 6, weighing these options, picking the best of the bunch. So you want to make sure to pick the best of the 5 options for implementing the plan that you have available. And your leadership will be definitely appreciative of having 5 options, because you can explain why you considered each one, and they can have input on it, of course, and they definitely like to have input on these things. 7. Implement the option that you chose. There are 2 steps to implementation that you want to think about. You want to minimize failure and maximize success. So you already presumably made the best decision. Now you want to implement this decision in the best possible manner. In order to minimize failure, you want to imagine that the project, cybersecurity project that you're implementing, completely failed, absolutely failed, utterly failed, worse than the Equifax data breach, something that was really bad. So not good situation. And then have a team in the room who have all the stakeholders, 6 to 8 people, ideally, if you can get those people in the room, then have them anonymously write out all the reasons for why it failed. All the reasons for why it failed, have them write it out anonymously, make sure that they're given anonymity so that they can put unpopular reasons in the mix. So for example, this failed because we thought it was easy to use, but the old lawyers in the company who are actually much less tech savvy than we think they are, and therefore they found it much harder to use than we thought they would. So that can be a reason for failure. And trust me, I've seen cybersecurity projects fail on that basis often, unfortunately. So we can go into that later. But anyway, so that is, you want to look at all the reasons why it failed and then address these failures in advance. So you want to maybe make it easier to use, simpler, more user-friendly than it intuitively seems it should be, and all the other failures that can happen. So that's for part 1 of number 7. Then part 2 of number 7 is maximize success. Think about all the ways that this option might succeed. Think about all the successes, all the ways that it might succeed. Think about it that it absolutely succeeded. And again, anonymously write out the reasons for success, and then integrate the ways it can succeed, the ways to bring about these methods, these successes into your project plan. So you're at number 7, you maximized the success, you minimized the failure. The last one, you want to evaluate the implementation process and revise as needed. For this, you need to make sure to have metrics. So have metrics for your cybersecurity project, for its implementation. You might want to do things like implement it in one department and see the kind of impact it has in the department's cybersecurity and on how well people actually follow the new rules and regulations and guidelines of the cybersecurity project that you have. And if you find that they're not following them nearly as well as you would have liked, you will, in that small context, in that one department, you can change things around, tweak things around before bringing it out more broadly. So that can give you evidence of how things are doing before you implement it across the company. So that's a way of approaching things, and there are many other ways. But the crucial thing is to have metrics, to have experiments, to measure the implementation process over time and revise it as needed to make sure that you maximize success and you minimize failure. So that 8-step process, going through it, thinking it through, evaluating things, takes about an hour just at the planning stage, and it's very effective too for major projects, for serious issues, whether as an individual, if you're an individual security consultant, or if you're looking at an individual who's looking at your career and you want to make a decision there, or more often it's done as part of a group. If you're part of a group that's, like I said, doing a security implementation project, or if you want to launch a product, a cybersecurity product, or whatever you want to do, this will be a really good process for you to go through.
Absolutely. I can definitely see that. And actually, a couple of specific steps that you mentioned so often in my experience are overlooked entirely, especially when you mentioned generating options, different plans, possible plans before making up your mind and go for one. That's largely underestimated in terms of importance, and then maybe later down the process you figure out that actually there were better way to do that, like to approach the whole project, but everyone just went for the first one. So I think that's extremely valuable, as well as your last point, the 8 steps, the measurement. It's so key, and I still find a lot of clients of mine that when we're talking about KPIs, they really are not up to speed with any type of tracking, or if they do track some level of KPIs, it's very, very limited and definitely does not capture all the data that they would need to have to make good decisions. This 8-step process is very well thought and very relevant, but especially those 2 steps, they are super key and largely underestimated in my opinion. It's great that you went through them into details, and I think that's these are valuable takeaways for everyone. And you also mentioned that you do have a quicker version of the same process. So in case we don't have 1 hour to go through this 8-step process, how can we quickly assess whether a decision is a good decision, and just trying to do our best in the decision-making process?
Yes, this is a 5-step process that you can use for any decision that you don't want to screw up. The previous one is for major decisions where you want to get as perfect as possible. This is for any decision that you don't want to screw up. I'll use the example of writing an important email to a client. So it only takes a couple of minutes to go through. First, what important information didn't I yet fully consider? So what evidence didn't you take into account? Again, confirmation bias and other problems cause us to ignore information that goes against our beliefs. So for example, if you're writing an email to a client, there might be information that would cause the client to not do, and you want the client to do something. There might be information that would cause the client to not do what you want the client to do. Now, if you can ignore that information, that would make the email not as strong as it could be. But if you instead take that information into account and integrate it into the email and address these potential problems that would cause the client to not do what you want them to do, the client would be much more likely to do what you want them to do. It would make a much stronger email. So that's one. Second, what dangerous judgment errors didn't I yet address? So what cognitive biases might be involved here? I talked about the information one. You might have the optimism bias about the client doing what you want them to do. So you want to calibrate that. I know that's a problem for me often. So think about the dangerous judgment errors. In my book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, lists the 30 most dangerous ones for professionals and how to address them. Third, what would a trusted and objective advisor suggest I do? So think about that angel on your shoulder. Think about what you would tell a trusted friend to do in this situation. You get about 50% of the benefit of this question just by asking it, by taking yourself outside of yourself. And you get the other 50% of the benefit by calling this trusted and objective advisor. Of course, unfortunately, you can't meet with them face-to-face in the current conditions. Now, 4, how have I addressed all the ways this could fail? So, remember what I talked about in the previous step, addressing all the ways it could fail. This is a similar question, and it's only meant to minimize failure. It's not maximizing success. So imagine that this project failed, sending the email to the client failed. What might have caused it to fail? Imagine all these scenarios. So for example, right now your client might be stuck at home and their kids might be crawling all over them, so they're in a bad mood and they're distracted. And so maybe you want to read your email as though you're your client, in the shoes of your client, and you're in a bad mood and you're distracted. And then you can revise the email to remove all the possible negative interpretations that could be associated with the email, and you want to also draw the attention of the client to the most important parts of the email. Finally, what new information would cause me to revisit this decision? So last one, fifth one, what would cause you to change your mind? So it's similar to the evaluation from the previous question, but here it's going to be not as rigorous. You can have a specific decision-making point that would cause you to reevaluate the situation. So for example, with the email to the client, you can say, If I don't hear back from the client in a week, I will call the client. So I'll give the client a call. Now, if you don't do that, you'll be spending your time just wondering each day, what would happen? What's it going? Is the client responding? Is the client ignoring me? But if you have that decision-making point in a week, then you can just let it go on to your other tasks, and be confident that in a week you can revise the situation, you can reevaluate it, give the client a call, and figure out what's going on. So these 5 questions, it just took me a couple of minutes to go through. They can save you many, many, many hours and thousands and thousands and thousands of euros of suffering if you use them effectively.
Yeah, definitely. No, this is a super useful tool and really, really quick, but help to think through the decision. I found it very useful. And let's go back a little bit to talking about the COVID pandemic. At the beginning of March, when COVID was not yet pandemic, you wrote a very interesting article highlighting the fact that companies are preparing for the COVID-19 pandemic, considering only wildly optimistic scenarios. And in the article, you suggested considering a specific scenario which was much more pessimistic, where COVID-19 isn't eradicated but keeps going on. Under this scenario, the coronavirus become like the flu, a seasonal affliction that comes every September, lasts through March. And in a few years, we might develop and make widely available a weak vaccine. One that decreases the likelihood of infection by 50% and lasts for a few months, but basically we're never going to get rid of it. Can you share with our audience why companies are specifically underestimating the risk created by coronavirus, and they are really considering optimistic scenarios even now that the coronavirus is actually a pandemic?
They're responding to the coronavirus pandemic in a very much of a fight or flight fashion. It's our intuition to respond to it in a fight or flight fashion. It would be like imagining, let's say, that Venice got flooded and then it stopped being flooded in a couple of weeks. That's the kind of reaction to which companies have. That's the kind of contingency plans they have prepared. That is what they're used to. But what they're not used to is Venice getting flooded and then staying flooded and then keeping being flooded. We're not used to that. That's not the mindset with which we're functioning because of what's called the normalcy bias. And of course, in the savanna environment, we didn't have any sort of major change that really changed our situation. We had to deal with the fight or flight threats in the moment. However, as a result, we are not adapted to dealing with huge, major, in-the-moment changes that change our world drastically. Instead, we suffer from the normalcy bias. The normalcy bias causes us to assume that the future will be like the past. We assume that the immediate and medium-term future in the next couple of years, at least, will be similar to what went on in the last couple of years. That's the tendency. That's how we feel. So we can't process the fact that a pandemic, the COVID-19, can change our world forever. We can't process it. It's just not there. It's very unintuitive. So people refuse to accept this possibility. Now they refuse to accept this possibility even though the top health authorities are generally acknowledging that, hey, this is a possibility. It's very interesting when I look at companies, the vast majority of them are functioning as though the pandemic will end in maybe a couple of months. So I'm not even saying, continuing for forever, but they're functioning as though the pandemic will end in a couple of months. They're saying, okay, the restrictions will be over and we'll go back to our old way of doing business. That is what the large majority of companies are doing right now. And that's preposterous. That's absolutely not the case. We know that COVID-19, the best case scenario. So let me draw out the most optimistic scenario. We know that it won't be eradicated there's no way for it to be eradicated unless there's a vaccine. It looks like it's spreading in warm climates as well as cold climates. So it's not just going to magically disappear in the summer. It might become less intense, but then it will definitely reappear in the fall. And it might not become that much less intense in the summer. So given that, it will keep going and will keep infecting people. What is going to happen? Well, the best health authorities tell us that the most optimistic, wonderful case for a vaccine being created is in 12 to 18 months, which means 18 months, but let's say 12 to 18 months. So let's just give the shorter number, 12 months. Now, then how much time will it take to produce enough of that vaccine, then distribute it to all the places that need the vaccine in order to vaccinate people, and then actually vaccinate people while protecting both people and the vaccinators from COVID-19 with masks and so on, protective personal equipment, which we have very little of. It will take another year. It will take another 18 months. So we have, in the most optimistic scenario, 2 to 3 years. That's the most optimistic scenario possible of when we will actually be safe from COVID-19. The first vaccine that we create, very likely, I mean, this is the most optimistic scenario. More moderate scenarios suggest that the first vaccine won't work, so it will take quite a bit more time to create an effective vaccine, maybe 5 to 7 years. So a moderate scenario would see us not getting rid of COVID-19 for 5 to 7 years. And then a pessimistic scenario, a realistic pessimistic scenario. Right now, we don't have an effective vaccine against the flu, and we've been fighting for the flu with vaccine, of course, for over a century. So given that we haven't invented an effective vaccine for over a century for the flu, and that the coronavirus has a lot of similarities to the flu, it's not quite the same thing at all, but it has a lot of similarities, it's possible that we will not create an effective vaccine, and a lot of health authorities are acknowledging this possibility. And that is the realistic pessimistic scenario. So companies are not even preparing for the realistic optimistic scenario. They're not even preparing for the 2 to 3 year horizon, not to speak of the never curing COVID-19 horizon. That's terrible. As risk management professionals, we need to be prepared not for the magical scenario, which is this COVID-19 will be gone by the summer. This is the magical scenario. Some aliens will come down and magically cure us all, right? That will not happen. They're not even preparing for the optimistic scenario. As risk management professionals, we need to work to prepare for the realistic pessimistic scenario. That's what we're being paid for. That's what we need to do. So if we need to prepare for that realistic pessimistic scenario, we need to push our companies to be prepared for COVID-19 to never be over. And again, in the most optimistic scenario, to be around for the next 2 to 3 years, more moderate scenario, 5 to 7 years. What does that mean? Well, that means that you need to make major changes in the way that you do business. You need to make major changes in your business model. In your internal team organization, the team will have to be virtual for a very long time, potentially forever, if you don't have an effective COVID-19 vaccine. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the team has to really change a lot of structures. Right now, people are at home and running on adrenaline. They are still enthusiastic, they're energetic, they are scared, they still have that fight or flight response, and they're pulling together, they're working to support the company. That will not happen that will run out in a couple of weeks, in a month or so, when it becomes much more clear that this is a long-term thing. Then what will people be doing? Well, you'll need to figure out how to replace the kind of things that people were able to do and got from in-office interactions. For example, motivation. People got a lot of motivation from working around their colleagues and working not at home but in the office. How will you replace that motivation? That's a big problem. People got a lot of problems solved from just in-the-moment conversations, noticing problems, and problem solving in the office. You need to replace that problem solving, problem noticing, and problem solving, both of those, conflict resolution. Then you need to replace accountability. Right now, people are being held accountable. Well, previously, people were being held accountable just by you as a leader walking around and then seeing what people are doing, checking in with them casually. You'll need to replace that. That will need to be replaced, accountability. And finally, last but not least, is trust, cultivating trust. How will you cultivate trust in this current environment? This is a huge problem. Right now, or previously, teams cultivated trust by just chatting over the water cooler about their kids, about what's going on, about what's going on in the football league, anything like that, casual life stuff. That's not happening right now. So you need to figure out how to replace that cultivation of trust inside the team. And this is just inside the team. So changing the business model for inside the organization. You also need to change the business model outside of the organization. That, of course, depends on each individual organization. So you need to change your business delivery. How will you interact with your vendors, with your clients, with the investors in the company over the long term, because it's not going to be a short-term thing. So you need to figure out that business delivery, and you need to figure out the cultivation of trust. So I talked earlier about trust. Previously, of course, you can cultivate trust for that face-to-face meeting, for the handshake, pat on the shoulder, meeting for lunch. You're not going to be able to do that right now. So you need to cultivate that trust somehow. So that's going to be very important for people to figure out how to cultivate trust with their stakeholders. And you also need to figure out how you're going to establish new business relationships. Business relationships are overwhelmingly established through meeting and face-to-face interaction. That will not happen right now. So you need to figure out how you will network and establish new relationships in this brave new world of the pandemic society that we find ourselves in. And this is just some of the things that businesses need to be doing and need to be thinking about. They need to be thinking about shifting their long-term strategic plans to have all of this in mind, to integrate changing their internal structure and changing their external business model structure in order to make sure to be adapted for the future of at least the next 2 to 3 years, more likely with a moderate scenario 5 to 7 years, and pessimistically speaking, but still something to prepare for, potentially the rest of our existence.
I'm so glad you are talking about the time frame of 2 to 3 years or even more, because I think that's something that is definitely a topic where you'll find so much resistance, and strategic decisions are still being made with the assumption that, as you said, everything will go back to normal. And for example, for companies who invested heavily in centralizations of processes, well, now they do face a situation where actually probably in the next few months and years, we will go back to a regionalization of processes, if we're talking about multinational companies, because just the fact that people cannot move around, certain decisions that will need to be made at regional or country level, also because of the different type of situation that each country is facing at the moment. So I see that trend, for example, that's just an example of a trend which is emerging, which is very different from what's been going on in multinational business since a while, which is more like centralization and standardization of processes across all the geographies and shared service centers and so on and so forth. And now we are facing the problem that you need to make decisions at regional level, but you don't have the structures, the people, and the processes to support that, because you centralize everything. And so, but still, when you talk about these topics, there is a lot of resistance around accepting the idea that the strategy might need to be reconsidered, not just reprioritize the key project, but reconsidered entirely, especially if you are in a business where you have a supply chain and production, for example, based on plants, and people need to come into your plants to produce your product. So you will need to consider different ways to do that, automatize or controlling from distance. In my experience, it's not happening yet.
Yep, it's definitely not happening yet. And I think it's a very important element that you're pointing out about multinational companies and regionalization. This is another element that could be added to the elements that I discussed, that is going to be something that really needs to be rethought. The decision-making processes, structural organization, this needs to be really seriously rethought and changed for the reasons that you highlighted. Yeah, it's a very big concern. I'm seeing a lot of companies not reacting to it adequately, not being prepared for it. And you know what? These are the companies that will be hobbled going forward, because they will have bad decision-making structures, bad processes that will not serve them in this new environment that we find ourselves in. And these are the companies that nimble competitors who realize, who are hearing what both you and I are saying, they will take the steps of changing their systems. They will take the steps of changing the processes. They will be prepared for the long term of the next several years, if not the rest of our lifetime. And they will be the ones who seize market share from these companies that are just not willing to accept the reality, falling into that confirmation bias, whose leaders were fired, as I mentioned, by the boards of directors. These are the companies that will be hobbled, that they will suffer from loss of clients, they will lose market share, and some of them will definitely go bankrupt.
Yeah, I can totally see that. Hopefully, companies and leaders will be quick enough to adopt the change, to see the reality and trying to manage risk properly. Well, Gleb, thank you very much for being with us today to talk about practical tools to make better decisions and evaluate the risks better, especially around the coronavirus situation.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a real pleasure.
I highly recommend to everyone to read your book, Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, to have a deeper understanding of the topics we just discussed today. In the book, you will also find several practical exercises that you can do to improve your ability to make better decisions, which I personally found very, very useful. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoy it, make sure you like it and share it. If you want even more resources on how to be extra effective as internal controls professionals, check out our website www.internalcontroltoolbox.com and subscribe to the email list. Thanks for listening and see you in the next episode.